Today we're going to bend some steel, support it with wood, and make a lounge chair.
Hi, Ben here. Now I know this might not look like a beginner level project, but we're just taking the same metal bending techniques that we experimented with before, but this time adding a little bit more wood to support them. We only used an angle grinder, circular saw, cordless drill, and orbital sander for this project. So the tools are very accessible and affordable, and I'm really excited with how we use metal to really accentuate the thinness of the design and also use it so that we can make the cushions magnet on. So check it out.
Steel yards can be intimidating places for beginners. I recommend calling ahead and ordering what you want so you can just go in and pick it up. For this project, I'm using plate steel that's 3/16 of an inch thick. It comes in a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet and cost about $170, but I had them cut it for me there. This makes it easier to transport and does some of the work for you. I made a rough mock-up of the profile of the chair using a bunch of scrap 2x4s. This involved a bit of trial and error, but I just kept screwing them together, adjusting them, and retrying different combinations until I had a rough profile that seemed to work. People come in all different lengths and have different preferences when it comes to comfort, so I recommend going through this process and building a mock-up that suits you. I then took measurements of each of the different facets and was ready to start bending the steel. The guys at the steel yard cut an 18-inch wide, 8-foot long piece of 3/16 of an inch thick steel for me. In retrospect, I probably should have used just 1/8 of an inch thick steel. That would have been plenty strong and would have saved some money and been lighter. I used the measurements from the 2x4 mock-up to draw lines on the steel, and then I scored along the lines using my angle grinder with a grinding disc. I'm just cutting a groove about half of the way through the steel, and I'm going to bend towards the groove. This is why I had to flip the steel over to cut the last two grooves. I like to use a silver Sharpie to draw lines on steel. This gives me a really clear mark to follow, and I just start real slow with the angle grinder until I cut the initial groove, and then I'm able to put a little more pressure on the grinder and cut halfway through. After cutting the last groove for the headrest, I then trimmed off the excess steel. I built this contraption out of scrap 2x4s for the bent metal benches that I did in episode 2 of this series. I'll put a link to that in the description box below. I clamped down a scrap piece of angle steel right along the lines that I had scored, and then clamped 2x4s to the piece of steel that I wanted to bend. I now have two nice handles and a leverage advantage for bending the steel. I then unclamped the piece and slid it down and clamped it on the next line that I had scored. The key to this contraption is the long 2x4s that stick out that I can stand on. This keeps me from sliding away as I try to lift. So even though this contraption is handy, it has its limitations. For this next bend, I needed it to go down, but there wasn't enough clearance on the floor, even if I cut the 2x4 handles shorter. So I put the steel up on some sawhorses and clamped it down. I then enlisted my sister Jessie as a counterweight and bent it down. This sort of worked, but once I got to about 45 degrees, my effort from pushing down was really just sliding me back. In order to try to get better traction on the floor, I swept up some of the dust and was able to bend it just a little bit farther, but still not quite far enough. After taking a closer look at the folds, I decided to grind away a little bit more with the angle grinder to create some more room. I gave it a shot bending it by hand, but it really wasn't budging. And this could have ended really badly. So I brought back the 2x4 contraption, but this time I clamped down the backrest of the chair. I was able to finish that bend, and then I took some short pieces of 2x4 and screwed them to the clamped on pieces to stabilize that section. I could now clamp on additional 2x4s and finish the bend that's going to go right underneath the knees. Now I was just eyeballing the angles versus the original mock-up, but you could measure the angles if you wanted to be exact. I don't really like measuring angles though, it always feels a little bit too much like math, so I just prefer testing it out and then adjusting. As you can see, the steel is quite strong and doesn't bend that easy, but it could lose shape over time, so I decided to make a light wood structure that'll support it just enough to hold it consistent. I had some Cumaru deck boards that I got from Advantage Lumber left over from a previous project. I cut short pieces just about 6 to 8 inches longer than each of the facets of the seat. I then drew lines corner to corner and used my circular saw to cut along this angled line. I then held these pieces up to the bent steel and traced the line that I would need to trim off. I then used the first piece to trace the lines for the second piece. Altogether, I cut 6 triangular pieces. Now, I know a lot of people will want plans for this project, but this project is really more about relative dimensions. It's all about bending the piece of metal and then cutting triangular pieces of wood to fit underneath it. If you tried to cut all the pieces out beforehand and hope that they would fit, you better be really precise with the saw or use a CNC. I used clamps to hold the wood pieces in place so that I could draw the lines that would tell me where I needed to trim the pieces. I sanded all the pieces using 150 grit sandpaper. Now, the dust from tropical hardwoods is quite toxic, so it's really important to wear dust protection and vacuum up the dust as you go. I'll tell you a little bit more about my new favorite personal safety device a little bit later in the video. Now, it's important to glue the pieces together at the right angles so that they'll fit perfectly against the steel. So I clamped the pieces to the steel and then applied the glue and then clamped the wood pieces to each other. I'm going to reinforce all the joints with screws screwed in from the back side so that the heads won't show. I'm really liking this magnet driver system from Micaton. There are these little magnet sleeves that just slide over your driver bits and they hold the screws firmly to the head of the driver. Tropical hardwoods are really hard and dense, so it's important to pre-drill all your holes. I glued and screwed in cross supports at the places where the side pieces overlap. I then added in L brackets to reinforce these joints. After screwing together the pieces for the other side, I assembled the whole base structure using the steel as a reference surface. Now, the inside of the structure is all going to be hidden underneath the steel, so I was able to add in a lot of L brackets to reinforce all the joints. I wanted this base to be really sturdy, so I just kept adding in additional cross supports using more L brackets. Construction adhesive is another option for reinforcing the joints if you're worried about them being a little bit too weak. Now, as I said before, the dust from tropical hardwoods can be really toxic, so it's important to use dust protection. RZmask are by far the most comfortable dust protection I have ever worn. The filters are replaceable and they filter out 99.9% of harmful particulates down to 0.1 microns. But for me, the thing that makes them the most effective dust mask is how comfortable they are. I've been in a lot of workshops where people aren't wearing proper breathing protection, and it's often because they're uncomfortable and fog up the glasses. So fixing the comfort problem encourages people to actually do the right and safe thing. To get your own RZ mask, click on the link in the description box below and use the promo code HomeMade to get 15% off your first order. I cleaned the Cumaru with acetone to remove all oil and dust prior to staining. I then used teak oil to finish the wood. Now, steel can be pretty cold to the touch, so I decided to make some pads for the chair using 1/4 inch thick industrial felt. I'll put a link to it in the description box below. I used my Kiwi knife to cut 18-inch wide strips of the felt, which is the same width as the steel. I then cut the pieces to length. I got these flat bar neodymium magnets and then traced around them on the back of the felt with a pencil. I then used my Kiwi knife to cut and scrape out a recess for the magnets. I then used fabric glue to glue small scrap pieces of fabric over the top of the magnets to hold them in place. I started getting better at this process, and after scoring straight lines, I was able to fold the felt and carve out a rectangular piece right out of it. I also experimented with these iron-on patches, which is less messy than the glue. The only tricky part about this is that the magnets stick to the iron, so you have to be careful to make sure you get it all heated up and pressed into place before lifting the iron away. I want the felt to sit nice and tight to the steel, so I added magnets on either side of the bend where your knees will go. After cleaning the steel with acetone, I sealed it with paste wax. I rubbed on a heavy coat, waited 15 minutes, and then rubbed off all the excess with a clean rag. Now I could drill holes through the steel and screw it to the wood base, but I want to keep the parts separate so that it's easier to move. The magnets hold the felt nice and flat to the steel and provide just enough cushion to make the chair nice and comfortable. The angle is perfect for a wall-mounted TV that's about 36 inches off the floor. I'm really happy with the accessibility of this design, and the materials are inexpensive compared to what chairs like this sell for. For more information, check out our website, and if you want to see what we're working on next, be sure to follow us on Instagram. Thanks again to RZmask, the sponsor for this video, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks! Bye!